Hello, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Thursday, the 7th of April. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 43 of the illegal Russian invasion. Then I'll introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will take a look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Ukraine is braced for a renewed Russian offensive on its eastern front as Russian forces withdraw from the shattered outskirts of Kyiv to regroup and intensify their attacks across Donbass. Ukraine's Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, called on NATO allies to supply more weapons to bolster Ukraine's war effort, including planes, heavy air defense systems, missiles, and armored vehicles. Speaking at NATO headquarters, Kuleba said that 3 items were on his agenda for when he talked to the allies and held bilateral meetings. Weapons, weapons, and weapons, he said. The UN General Assembly has voted this afternoon to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said the new package of Western sanctions against Russia were not enough, and that without more painful measures and the supply of weapons, Russia would view the actions as permission to launch a new bloody attack. Russia's defense ministry said it used missiles to destroy 4 fuel storage facilities in the Ukrainian cities of Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Chuhuiv. The ministry said the facilities were used by Ukraine to supply its troops near the cities of Mykolaiv and Kharkiv, and in the Donbass region in the southeast of the country. Russian air attacks are now focused mainly on areas of eastern Ukraine, and Russian forces are trying to encircle Ukrainian troops in that region, according to the Ukrainian presidential advisor, Alexei Arestovich. The Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said that the US supplying Ukraine with weapons would not contribute to the success of Russian-Ukrainian talks. Poland's Deputy Foreign Minister, Marcin Przydacz, said that the country needed financial assistance over the arrival of 2.5 million Ukrainian refugees, many of them children. The Greek Foreign Minister, Nikos Dendias, said Athens would ask the International Court of Justice at The Hague to investigate war crimes in Mariupol. Ukraine and Hungary have again exchanged barbed words. Ukraine's foreign ministry said it considered Hungary's willingness to pay for Russian gas in rubles an unfriendly act. Hungary's foreign minister, Péter Szijjártó, confirmed that fuel for his country's nuclear power plants had just arrived by air from Russia, and restated that Budapest did not support proposals for European energy sanctions against Russia. Defense ministers from the Black Sea coastal countries held a video call to discuss the war in Ukraine, mines floating in the sea, and regional security, the Turkish defense minister said, adding that the ministers called for an immediate ceasefire. And the number of alleged Russian war crimes Ukraine says is under investigation has increased to 4,820, according to a recent update from the country's Prosecutor General's office. Now, we are lucky enough this evening to be joined by a regular contributor and friend of the programme, Ruth Watson. Ruth is an activist and a campaigner and leads the campaign Scotland a Brand. Ruth, how are you doing this evening?
Hi, Chavanoa, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening. One thing out of that set of headlines from Ukraine this afternoon, Ruth, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that the US supplying Ukraine with weapons would not contribute to the success of Russian-Ukrainian talks. And it struck me immediately that in the nature of diplomatic speak, does that maybe mean the precise opposite? Is it a tacit recognition, perhaps, from Putin's advisors that, like it or not, Putin is only going to recognize strength and blunt military force?
I think Putin was always just going to, that's just the way the man operates. It's, when people show you who they are, you have to believe them. Putin has always been the strong man. That's why he's popular in Russia, especially among those of the sort of USSR era, people of my age, I guess, and older, who really thought that Putin's approach to hard diplomacy, and by hard diplomacy, I mean basically sort of thuggery, was the way to sort of bring back what they viewed as national pride to their I'm sorry, I'm getting terrible feedback in my ear. It's very distracting. I don't know if that can be turned down a bit. Sorry, but it was very difficult for Russians during the era of the USSR to, as USSR declined in power, for them to have strength and sort of what they viewed as national pride. Um, and and I think Putin gave them that back, but it's come at a cost. And you just have to look at the way in which Putin has engineered his power, his subversion of Russian democracy. So he was only supposed to have two, sort of two terms in office, and then he did this very sort of neat little tango with Medvedev, who was the prime minister, who then took over as like a puppet president for a term, and then Putin came back in and very quickly started sort of changing the rules, and now basically he's president for life, pretty much. So you just have to look at the tactics that he has used, which is very much the sort of strong arm. And in some ways now, I guess, perhaps history will look back and think that what has happened in Russia has been very similar to what happened politically and socially in Germany in some ways during the 1920s and 30s, which is a country which had a great national pride and felt humbled and sort of took a grudge on against the rest of the world, and then sort of made plans to try and take it over. And to see one of their spokespeople the other day being asked what the intention of Russia was, and he said something along the lines of to develop a new Eurasia that stretches from Lisbon to Volgograd or Vladivostok or wherever it was. And I remember my dad back in the day saying that the problem with Russia and the problem with China is that they were expansionist regimes. And I think that Russia very much sees itself less in the prism of sort of being a rival to Europe and the West, but sort of looking at what he sees as the era of the nation that the empire that he was basically he'd thugging. Putin's tendency to eliminate rivals and political adversaries with poison and brutality is not new. That was sort of honed during the USSR era, the Soviet era. But I think that living next to China, which is growing in ascendance, which is ascending in relevance, I think that a lot of this informs the sort of Russian political mentality. So Putin was always going to be who he always has been, which is a thug. And he always was going to try and do it through brutality, because I guess that's how angry small men sometimes behave.
Absolutely, completely, Ruth. Thank you. That was a great explanation and perspective I think we're going to be looking at more and more over the next few days and weeks, I'm afraid. But let's move to our first story this evening, because in Geneva, the United Nations General Assembly has suspended Russia from the UN Human Rights Council over reports of gross and systematic violations and abuses of human rights by invading Russian troops in Ukraine. The US-led push garnered 93 votes in favour, while 24 countries voted no, and 58 abstained. A two-thirds majority of voting members, abstentions don't count, was needed to suspend Russia from the 47-member council. Suspensions are rare. Libya was suspended in 2011 because of violence against protesters by forces loyal to the then leader Muammar Gaddafi. The resolution adopted by the 193-member General Assembly draft expresses grave concern at the ongoing human rights and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Particularly, it reports of human rights abuses in Russia. Russia had warned countries that a yes vote or abstention will be viewed as an unfriendly gesture, with consequences for bilateral ties, according to a note seen by Reuters. Russia was in its second year of a 3-year term on the Geneva-based council, which cannot make legally binding decisions. Its decisions do send important political messages, however, and it can authorise investigations. Moscow is one of the most vocal members on the council, and its suspension bars it from speaking and voting, officials say, although its diplomats could still attend debates. They would probably still try to influence the council through proxies, said a Geneva-based diplomat. Last month, the council opened an investigation into allegations of human rights violations, including possible war crimes, in Ukraine since Russia's invasion. Since the invasion, which began on the 24th of February, the General Assembly has adopted two resolutions denouncing Russia with 141 and 140 votes in favour. So, Ruth, is this a sign perhaps that the United Nations is finally beginning to get its act together after 6 weeks of war in Ukraine and the inevitable reporting of brutal war crimes and indications of possible genocide? Or, on the other hand, is it a case, again, a little more of the UN a little too late and a little too hamstrung?
Well, from the outset, I should obviously make clear that what is happening in Ukraine is beyond horrific and beyond appalling. Having said that, and being brutally realistic, I don't think the UN could have moved any faster than it did, because it would be very difficult within a shorter span of 6 weeks to be able to persuade the nations of the world to take punitive action against another very significant member state. Russia is a significant member state and one of the founding members of the United Nations. And their reach goes very far in terms of the sort of business dealings, huge exporters of timber and fertilizer. They're massive. I mean, Russia's wheat stores, grain stores, feed a large chunk of the developing world, especially in Africa. So to take sanctions, or to be in any way sort of condemning Russia's actions, it's a big step to take. And I think that one of the things that's very interesting, it's not so much the countries that voted against this move, which, the nations that voted against it are pretty much on the sort of international roll of shame for human rights already. So you can kind of understand why they perhaps don't want to be putting their head above the parapets. Interestingly, given the rolling and huge victory for the very unsavoury and pretty despicable leader of Hungary, Hungary voted just 2 days ago. Hungary voted to sanction Russia, to remove them, and that's a big move. One of the other things that perhaps to me is significant is that both Brazil and India abstained. Now, given that Brazil and India are on the sort of the trading bloc, is it Brazil, India, Russia, China, and there's one other in there, I can't remember. But I mean,
BRIC
that's a
countries.
huge deal. Sorry?
BRIC countries, that's right.
Yeah. So it's a huge deal for Brazil and India to have abstained. I think that in many ways, I think that Russia might be paying attention to that, because they're losing friends fast. Um, and I mean, on the one hand, you could look at this and go, yes, this is fantastic that finally the United Nations has acted. They can't remove, there's no mechanism by which they could remove Russia from the seat, the United Nations, but the humanitarian aspect side of it, they can. The human rights aspect of it, they can. And I think that what we're watching play out could go one of several ways. I think China might be quietly putting down its sabers that it was rattling in the direction of Taiwan. I think perhaps the appetite for China perhaps piggybacking off Russia, um, and sort of taking over dominion of the South China Sea, which they are trying to lay claim to, which is significant, massive issue happening in Southeast Asia. If you go on to Southeast Asian sort of political chatter, this is being watched with significant alarm across Southeast Asia because of what they think China might do. And in some ways, it's almost like we're looking at a sort of rerun of geopolitics being sort of divvied up. I mean, it's almost like China's gone, you know what, well, we'll take this side and you guys can take, have you ever seen The Man in the High Castle? It's kind of like we're almost in that territory,
Yeah.
And I don't think it looks like Russia's doing as well as it thought it might. And of course, as it gets stretched and as it perhaps loses credibility, then you're looking at places like Georgia, which has been the scene of terrible repression. And of course, you can't forget that today, I think today is the 30th anniversary of the beginning of the Bosnian War.
Yep.
And Serbia today voted against Russia. Serbia voted to remove Russia, and that is huge. That is, I mean, that's one of those things that I suspect will be sending reverberations around that part of Eastern Europe.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ruth. And certainly the geopolitics of this I think, are only starting to develop, so we'll continue to watch them closely. Meanwhile, Ukraine has called for more heavy weaponry from its Western allies and ruinous sanctions against Moscow as EU member states prepare to halt Russian coal imports but remain divided over a more far-reaching energy ban. The West must bring Russia to justice, President Vladimir Zelensky told the Greek parliament, and teach Moscow that those who blackmail Europe with an economic and energy crisis always lose. Andriy Yermak, the head of the presidential office, said that sanctions must be ruinous enough for us to end this terrible war. The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, said the bloc should approve its fifth round of economic sanctions, including a ban on Russian coal imports worth about €4 billion today, and said that measures against Russian oil would be discussed by foreign ministers on Monday. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba stressed the vital importance of weapon supplies as well as sanctions, calling on all allies to put aside their hesitations, their reluctance to provide Ukraine with everything it needs. He added, the more weapons we get and the sooner they arrive in Ukraine, the more human lives will be saved. NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg agreed that the distinction was irrelevant and said the alliance's members would step up with air defense systems, anti-tank weapons, but also heavier weapons. Especially now as Moscow repositions and rearms its forces, was the moment to do so, he said. So Ruth, firstly, we will continue to insist on full oil and gas embargo for Russia, Dmytro Kuleba said. And he said, I hope we will never face a situation again when, to step up the sanctions pressure, we need atrocities like Bucha to be revealed. So is he right in a sense? Is it as transactional as that? We need to be shown another human rights catastrophe and more war crimes in order that we then increase the pressure on Russia? Or is there any realistic prospect of a proper embargo from a Europe which seems still to be addicted to Russian oil and gas?
I think that this shows how life in a global world is complicated. Um, we have set our structures up. In this country, you know, Scotland is more than self-reliant in oil and gas and wind power and alternative energies. You know, we can do it for ourselves, and yet look at the prices that we're now having to pay because we don't control our own energy resources, and they're sort of sold in the open market. And when you look at Europe and what's happening across Europe, as part of the efforts to try and bring about international peace by developing international co-reliances, I don't know if that's a word, but you know what I mean, international sort of dependencies. I think that was part of the thinking, was that if Russia needed Europe's money and Europe needed, you know, if we were trading with each other and we became integrated into each other's economies, then we would not precipitate acts of economic self-harm on each other through acts of war, for example. And Putin's just gone full Raj and gone, you know what, I don't care, because he recognizes, probably quite astutely, that, and very cynically, that that nobody wants to turn the lights off. You know, nobody wants to shut the hospitals down because we don't have enough power for it. But I can't remember the name of the politician. I think it was an Italian politician earlier today that said that we need to decide, is it, you know, between turning on our air conditioners and watching people being butchered in Bucha. And I think that I think he was right. I mean, I think that basically Europe is at that point, and I include Scotland in being European because I will never give up on Scotland being European. Um, that I think that he is right, that Europe has to decide what its priorities are. But it's very difficult to turn around to somebody and say, yeah, well, you know what, you can't afford to heat your house as it is, but actually then there's not going to be any power because we're switching it off. I think that what we're seeing is a very, very hasty throwing together of policies to actually stalling. So there was some thought, there was a line of thought that said if we implemented sanctions in an incremental way, putting the squeeze on, then that would give the diplomatic pressure to force Russia into an uncomfortable position, which would mean that it would reconsider its choices. But that incremental implementation was also supposed to try and sort of hide the fact that we were being total hypocrites by basically funding Putin's regime through purchasing oil and gas. It also was a way in which it was stalling to try and give enough time for the Americas, both Canada and the USA, to start providing LPG, liquid petroleum gas, and other through what with great foresight it turns out the Poles and the Baltic states have done with their what they call their Freedom Line, which means so. So I think that there's been a very difficult and perhaps deeply unsavory. There can be very few politicians and leaders that feel as though their hands are clean in Europe right now because we are still funding Putin. I mean, we're not alone in this. I mean, any one of us, that's sort of basically turning on our electricity or running our cars right now, we're all complicit. So, but we're
Yep.
complicit because the structures are there for us to be complicit. Um,
Yep.
so I hope that yet again this gives us a moment perhaps to put into focus the very, very significant reasons why we, and I hope the Scottish Government and I hope an independent Scotland, will work very hard to look again at sustainability and being self-reliant. We have to be, because this shows what happens. It takes one rogue state and suddenly you're looking at perhaps international famine again.
Thanks, Ruth. Now, as it happens, we're going to look at energy policy a little bit more, so that's a perfect segue. Thank you. Because Boris Johnson's energy security plan has been dismissed as a missed opportunity to bring down bills rapidly over its failure to fund energy efficiency upgrades or back onshore wind farms in the face of Tory backbench opposition. While the government's plans to set targets for long-term expansion of nuclear, offshore wind and solar capacity, it stopped short of doing so for onshore wind. The proposals also lacked a major intervention to help households lower their gas usage by improving insulation standards. Labour's Shadow Business and Energy Secretary Ed Miliband said that Johnson had been held to ransom by backbench opposition to wind farms. Energy experts and environmental groups labelled the plan inadequate, warning it would do little to address the urgent need to tackle sky-high bills and reduce dependence on gas imports, including from Russia. The strategy did set ambitious targets for offshore wind generation, with the government raising its target from 40 to 50 gigawatts by 2030. But Johnson did not back a wind industry proposal to double onshore capacity to 30 gigawatts over the same period. The UK government backed away from setting targets for onshore after fierce opposition from senior Tories, including the Chief Whip, Chris Heaton-Harris, who's the MP for Daventry in Northamptonshire, and the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps, who called the turbines eyesores. Responding to the energy security strategy, the University of Strathclyde's Centre for Energy Policy Director, Professor Karen Turner, said that this strategy sets out a number of paths to greater security around the supply of low-carbon and renewable energy in the UK. However, while the attempt to address the supply challenge is essential and welcome, there needs to be much greater focus on the question of demand. The fundamental question, she said, which is critical to the UK's long-term energy security and that the strategy fails to adequately grapple with, is how do we change demand? How do we change this at scale and rapidly? So Ruth, first of all, this sounds to me a little bit like the strategy is like so much other policy we see from this Tory government in Westminster just now. It's intensely political, responding only to the very short-term political priorities of Tory politicians. How can a national energy security policy not include significant onshore wind generation because a few Tory MPs say their constituents don't like how it looks? And I'll have to admit here, I may be biased, but I can't see how anything could make the appearance of Northamptonshire, where Chris Heaton-Harris is the MP, any more dreary than it already is.
Well, I am afraid I can't speak to the dreariness of Northamptonshire, but it's very hard to see where we go from here if we don't have a significant rethink. It's deeply alarming to see a government, the Tory government, that's fixated on nuclear. One can only imagine that somebody somewhere is getting a big kickback. Hinkley Point is many years away from being operational. I mean, I think they're talking about building another 8 nuclear power stations um, to be a solution, but we're looking at 30 years away. So unless we're planning on going back to sort of living by candlelight, that's not realistic. I mean, I guess what would be really good would be if this perhaps gets people thinking about more creative ways of doing things. Whether that be putting solar panels on people's houses, all new builds perhaps having solar panels, or heat sinks in the gardens or the parks, coming up with more creative ways of using natural resources. I'm a huge fan of wind energy, but I think the big blades are problematic. There's a sort of new one that kind of spirals, which is meant to be much better both for birds, and it reduces noise. And if I may be wrong on this, but I think it might be more sustainable, because at the moment there's a huge issue with wind farms, because those great big turbines, which I have to say every now and then, I don't know how many of you have ever been on the road with one of them, but every now and then where I live, you sort of get caught on a motorway behind one of these things being transported up to the North Sea, and they are, I mean, they're beyond muckle. They're huge. They're just vast. They take up, even cut up into chunks. They are absolutely vast, the infrastructure that goes into a wind turbine, and they're not recyclable. So at the end of their lifetime, they just go into landfill, or I think in Denmark they're using them as bus shelters and stuff, sort of chopped up into bicycle shelters. But so they're wind energy, of course, is clean. But then speaking to friends up in Shetland, I lived in Shetland for several years, many years ago, and I was speaking to one of my friends up there who has a croft, and she said that it's heartbreaking in Shetland, because a lot of their sites of special scientific interest, which is basically most of Shetland, because it's such an amazing landscape with so many sort of amazing little beasties, um, that huge swathes of their hillsides are being given over to to wind and wind generation, and that's causing a lot of environmental damage. And so I guess we have to find ways of saving the planet without destroying the planet. And when I was reading the news yesterday and saw a very alarming story that 80% of people who were tested in a test of people's blood, 80% of people had microplastics in their blood cells and in their lungs, but in their blood cells. Now we have to find a way of living our lives without being culprits, being responsible for our own demise. And nuclear can't be the answer. And I think wind power is, but I don't trust. I'm afraid, this Conservative government to be doing anything based on ethics and what's right. I suspect it comes down to whatever kickback they can give their pals.
The cynicism I can understand, Ruth, completely. Let's look at another aspect of the energy crisis and the Westminster's response to it, because there are reports that Rishi Sunak has vetoed plans to ease the cost of living crisis for millions of households after proposals to more than double the energy bill rebate scheme were rejected, according to a leak. A report in the newspaper says an early draft of the energy security strategy drawn up by the Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng's department included measures to increase the £200 energy rebate to £500 or more for households or just fuel-poor homes, but the recommendation was rejected by the Treasury. Responding to the report, the SNP Shadow Chancellor Alison Thulis MP said, "The Tory cost of living crisis is spiralling out of control, with households struggling to make ends meet and people being pushed into hardship and poverty. The reality is that the Chancellor's £200 loan was already pitiful and will do little to tackle the crisis. However, it speaks volumes of how detached this Tory government is that the Chancellor reportedly blocked attempts to increase it. She continued, Sunak must return from recess with an emergency budget and use the reserve powers available to him and convert the energy loan to a more generous grant. Reverse the £1,040 cuts to universal credit. Match the Scottish child payment UK-wide. Introduce a real living wage to boost incomes. Reduce or remove VAT on household energy bills. And follow the Scottish Government's 6% uprating of benefits. So, Ruth, the earlier draft Parting said that either the increase gave three options: increase the amount of the rebate from £200 to £500, delay the point at which the rebate has to be repaid or extend it, or exempt at least some fuel-poor households from all or some of the repayment. None of these three options survived to make it into the final document. Are you surprised?
I've lost sound. I'm afraid I can't hear you. I'm currently trying to log into Broadcasting Scotland on my phone so that I can hear your questions. So
Not a problem, Ruth.
give me 2 seconds, I'm afraid.
Not a problem. What we'll do is we'll continue with the next story, and Ruth will rejoin us when she can. Rishi Sunak paid £30,000 a year to secure her non-domiciled tax status, her spokesperson has confirmed, and accepted it was possible that Akshata Murthy uses the status to take advantage of tax havens for income earned outside the UK. As political pressure increased on the Chancellor and his spouse, the spokesperson said that Ms Murthy had no plans to say where she pays tax on overseas income, as that information was not relevant. The spokesperson declined to elaborate on the initial explanation for Ms Murthy's non-dom tax status, the fact she has Indian citizenship, when this would still mean such a tax arrangement was a choice. They accepted it was possible that Murthy's arrangements meant that she minimised her tax using tax havens. They said no further details would be given, other than to say that Murthy abided by all necessary rules. Commenting on Akshata Murthy's non-dom status, the SNP Deputy Westminster leader, Kirsten Oswald MP, said, people will be appalled at the revelation that the UK's millionaire Chancellor and his family are benefiting from non-dom status, allowing them to save on their tax bill while hiking it for the rest of us. While non-dom status may be legal, there are a whole host of questions the Chancellor must now answer, including exactly how much he and his family have benefited in cash terms from this loophole, as well as making it clear in which tax jurisdiction is being paid on this income and if they are using tax havens. Rishi Sunak and the rest of his Tory government, they continued, are so far removed from what ordinary families are facing during this Tory cost of living crisis. They either don't even know where to begin to support people because they're so out of touch, despite the wealth of expert advice, or they simply don't care. Now, let's see if Ruth is back with us now. Ruth, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you again. Thank you very much for persisting. So this is one of these stories that is just, it gives you the grue, doesn't it? I mean, honestly, anybody who doesn't have just a wee bit of bulk sitting right here just doesn't have a heart in them. It's so Mrs. Sunak has. I'm reading from. I took a screenshot of this series of tweets earlier so I could refer to it today because the guy explains it really well. Mr. at Dan Needle, Neidle on Twitter. And he very clearly explains, he's a sort of tax and law expert, and he very clearly explains that obviously Mrs. Sunak is not doing anything illegal, but she is making a clear choice. So she is apparently ordinarily domiciled from her country of birth, which is India, which is perfectly legal for her to do. However, it is under the law, non-doms, generally speaking, only can do this if they've got lots of money. So she is choosing, there's a remittance basis, and she is making a claim under accessing the remittance basis. UK resident individuals who meet the status conditions not ordinarily resident and or not domiciled in the UK, must decide each year whether they wish to be taxed on the remittance basis or not in respect of their foreign income and gains. So she chooses to pay, I think she pays tax on £30,000 a year, or she pays £30,000 in tax a year. I think that's the way it goes, because of what she's choosing to pay. But this is a woman who lives here full time. Her children go to school here full time, and she's living in a grace and favour apartment that we, the taxpayers, are paying for. And her husband is living here full time with the prospects of a career, obviously, that makes, looks pretty much certain that he, if he got the chance, he'd be prime minister of our country. And well, our country, the country in which we're currently neighbours to, but are governed by. Now, this is a family who, there was actually quite a lot of debate as to whether or not she was even paying the proper taxes in India, because she has so many residencies around the world that it was perfectly possible that she was kind of sort of slipping in that liminal tax space that sort of people who've got lots of properties and lots of homes can sometimes try and avoid get through. And actually, I think that's one of the things, interestingly, that's one of the things that the EU was planning to tighten up on. So it may well be that Mr. Sunak is reaping that maybe Rishi Sunak has found the only Brexit benefit is that he and his wife don't have to pay taxes properly. Because of course we've sort of managed to sidestep the EU tightening up of such rules, and it is deeply worrying, actually, that somebody who's writing the rules, somebody who's telling us that he knows the pain we're going through, somebody who tells us that we have to abide by rules and pay our taxes, and he's managing to sort of slide past it. The other interesting thing, which another Twitter, I spend far too much time on Twitter, another Twitter spotted earlier, which is that Rishi Sunak's wife, when claiming for the furlough scheme, clearly stated that her business and her residence was England. So there are quite a lot of questions to be asked about this, and I suspect that a lot. I mean, much as I absolutely, I mean, Rishi Sunak is like the sort of, he's not the pound shop version. He's like the billionaire shop version of that weird one out the Young Ones. You know what I mean? He's kind of like, the monobrowed guy out the Young Ones. And that's kind of Rishi Sunak is like a sort of the Winchester version of that. And he's slightly gawky, and we're all supposed to kind of go, oh, he's a bit of a, he's a lovely young lad, clean cut young lad, nice Rishi. And it's really hard. He definitely had aspirations for sticking the boot in and getting the job in number 10. And it's very difficult to think that perhaps sort of Carrie Antoinette and Boris Johnson aren't the ones who are sticking the boot in with this, or their team, because they see that he's the one viable prospect.
Yep.
And it just makes you, I mean, really, rats fighting in a sack. It just, it doesn't come close.
I was going to ask you about the Tory politics of it. However, we're really tight for time this evening, Ruth, so we'll come back to that another time. However, I'm delighted that you have identified, finally, a Brexit bonus. Well done. That's only taken us more than a year. Let's move on, because the UK government is... The UK government is failing to tackle the cost of living crisis compared to other European nations, as they take real action to soften the blow of rising prices and energy bills. In France, the state-owned energy company EDF has been forced to take an €8.4 billion hit to profits to ensure that energy bills rise by no more than 4%. Also, low-income French households received a one-off payment of €100 to help with rising energy costs. Plus, France has also introduced a 15-cent per litre reduction in the cost of fuel. The German government is cutting fuel by 30 cents on petrol and introducing a €300 cost of living payment, with a further €100 for each child and an additional €100 for anyone who's on social security. Meanwhile, in Ireland, each household will receive a €200 energy rebate, with those already claiming fuel allowance receiving an extra €125. Commenting, the SNP MSP Paul McLennan said, as European countries are stepping up and helping people through the cost of living crisis with real action, the Tory UK government continues to sit on its hands. If EU nations can do this, why can't Westminster? Energy bills and food prices are rocketing, and the Chancellor has done nothing to lessen the impact on low-income families, who will have to make the unthinkable decision between choosing to heat their homes or feed their children. So, Ruth, some say that the UK government made a political choice not to act, and I would I would maybe go further and say that this is a political act to make things worse for ordinary people. Now, why would a government with a majority as large as the Tories have in Westminster act and do that kind of thing? Is it because they don't care, or they don't understand, or is there something else going on here?
I think asking me to analyze the logic and the inner thinking of of the current government in Westminster is to ask why the clown in it carries that red balloon around. I have no idea. I just know that I'm looking at something that's fully bonkers. So I don't understand why a government would intentionally push harm upon people. I don't understand why a government uh, while we are in the midst of a cost of living crisis, would sell the national grid off to Australia. I don't know why this government does many things. I can only assume that there's a backhander in it for them, that somebody somewhere is making money. I mean, that's what it seems to come down to. I mean, it's kind of like, I don't know if any of you watched Don't Look Up, but it's kind of like they're asset stripping all of the nations in this country on these islands to kind of build their own ark and get the heck out of Dodge. I remember watching a program when I lived in Malaysia. I was watching a program about illegal logging happening. I mean, just appalling desecration of the wilderness. And one of the Indonesian politicians being interviewed said, "Well, when you get into power, you only have 5 years to get rich." And I kind of think that that's where we are at with this current government in Westminster. It's but the other thing that you can't lose sight of is that is there's an age-old tradition on these islands of using poverty as a tool to control the population. If people are tired and they're hungry and they're afraid and they're desperate, then they're so preoccupied in just making it through the day that they aren't going to be paying attention to the news and current affairs or asking themselves the nuances of sort of policy and until it gets to a certain point, and that's the point where suddenly you've got people, Madame Defarge out getting out the knitting needles, and but I think we can't lose sight of the fact that several years ago, I think it was Jacob Rees-Mogg himself, but the Tories did consider reintroducing workhouses. I mean, they were talking about bringing back workhouses, and I really genuinely think that we are actually at a point where in England the National Health Service has been eroded to the point that I think there's now 500 GP practices in England. In London alone are part of a private health consortium owned by America. And I think that this is just everything's being plumped up for being sold off and so that people stop caring about it. And of course, Scotland's the outlier because the Scottish government has been protecting these things. So we're still in a good enough position that we're actually still paying attention and we still see we have choices. The one interesting thing about this, in a fully depressing way, is that I mean, I'm speaking to a few economists about why Brexit came about, and many of them think that it was a kind of bucking of the trend, and people thinking that Brexit wouldn't actually happen, but going, you know what, we just want to. David Cameron wants us to stay in the EU, so we'll give him a bloody nose. Well,
Yep.
the joke's on them, isn't it? But I think that
Abs-
what might happen for us, actually depressingly, in a way it works for us, is that Project Fear won't work this time round because who could imagine anything worse than what we've currently got? So in some ways, the misery that's being forced on us by the English, the political maniacs in England and their
mhm.
lackeys up here, actually may well end up working for Scottish independence because really, how much worse could things can't be worse in an independent Scotland than they currently are. So in some ways, the Scottish government has a chance of delivering the independence movement. The Yes movement has much more of an opportunity to deliver a message of hope because things are now just so god awful.
Well, that's a really good point, Ruth, and you've managed. I try and be glass half full, and you being glass half full there too. I'm also going to give you the prize for the best metaphor of the day: building an ark to get out of Dodge City, which is in Kansas. But let's move on to the next story because our time is against us this evening. Because back in Scotland, at the launch of his party's council manifesto today, the Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar pleaded with Tory voters to come back to Labour, saying, "I say to those directly, Boris Johnson has let you down. Boris Johnson has let the United Kingdom down. Boris Johnson is a corrupt joke and a liar. You don't need to hold your nose and vote Tory anymore. Come home and vote Scottish Labour." Mr Sarwar announced a raft of policies which would more properly be within the remit of the Scottish Parliament and Westminster, and are mostly out with the remit of local government. Manifesto policies include capping bus fares at £1.80, cutting the price of rail tickets in half for 3 months, a windfall tax for oil and gas companies and other big businesses, abolishing the council tax and replacing it with a system based on property values, a £15 per hour wage for social care workers, free residential care for all over 65s, and an education recovery plan tailored to every school pupil, including targeted tutoring. Ruth, one other example of this was the manifesto says where they are in power, Labour will encourage the building of more social housing and will ensure new homes are well connected with their local communities. I'm just wondering, how might one encourage the construction of social housing as a local authority? Might it just not be rather better just to get on and build some social housing?
Well, if memory serves, and I'm pretty sure it does, when Labour was last in power in Scotland well over a decade and a half ago, they only built 6 in the entire time that they were in power. So, so I mean, that's a mind-boggling statistic. But I remember my jaw dropping at the time I heard it at a conference, SNP conference. So I'm pretty sure that it's true. Um, I think that Labour's at that point where they're basically saying, "Vote for us, and we'll get Dolly Parton to come and sing you Hallelujah for breakfast." You know, if you've no chance of getting into power, you can promise whatever you want. I had a very interesting conversation with Gordon McIntyre Kemp of Believe in Scotland, who was saying that what's really interesting is that when you overpromise, people don't believe it, and he was saying that. Now my memory, I'm sorry, at the moment is pretty bad, but I'm pretty sure that it was if you promised pensioners an extra £160 um, a week, you know that they would believe that the Scottish government could deliver that. But if you were to offer them, say that we could manage, the Scottish government would deliver another £200 a week, which actually the economists are pretty clear would be possible. But if you were to tell them that was what was on the cards, they would be less likely to vote for the people making that promise because they thought it was
Yeah.
unrealistic and they smelt a rat. And I think I think we're pretty much in rat territory with Anna Sarwar at the moment, I'm afraid to say, because I mean, unless the rat is wearing an orange sash and playing the flute, because I mean, I it's so depressing, I mean, Labour used to stand for something really meaningful, and I just don't know what's happened to them. They've lost their way so far that they actually, I mean, they just don't talk with authenticity anymore. I would love for Labour to go, you know what? I don't care if you vote for us or not. This is who we are and this is what we stand for. And these are our policies. But at the moment, it's this scattergun approach of, well, if you don't like these principles, I've got others. And Anna Sarwar is talking, about Labour being fantastic, but they've got somebody who is very clearly, in my view, very clearly a sectarian bigot in their boots. You can't have a former leader. I mean, unless the guy has undergone a complete volte face and now realizes the error of his ways, and that may well be the case. He may have renounced all forms of sectarianism, but it's very hard to see in Glasgow when you get somebody who has been a former leader in the Orange Lodge. It's very hard not to see that as the nastiest of dog whistles,
Yep.
having them as a candidate. And for Labour to say, "Come home, Tories, we're one of us." And when we look at what's happening down in England, where the Tory party, the sort of further to the left of the Tories are now leaving and going to the Labour Party, it really is the case that if you vote Labour, you get Tory in so many more ways than one.
Yep.
I'm not
Abs-
quite sure what planet Anasar was on, but I'm not sure that it's one that anyone's going to get a lot of votes for.
well, absolutely. But thank you, Ruth. That was that I couldn't disagree with anything that you're saying there. But let's move on to the next story now, because almost 3,000 COVID-19 deaths have been added to the UK's official figures after the discovery of a data error in England. The cumulative number of people who have died within 28 days of testing positive for coronavirus rose by an extra 2,714 on Wednesday, in addition to 233 newly reported deaths. It means the total number of deaths in the UK is within 28 days of a positive test is now 169,095. The UK Health Security Agency said due to a data processing error, a number of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test were not reported in a timely manner. The 2,714 deaths, all of which occurred in England this year, were added retrospectively to the government's coronavirus dashboard yesterday evening. The revision to the figures narrows the gap slightly between the government's preferred death toll, based only on people who have died within 28 days of testing positive, and the number who have had COVID-19 recorded on their death certificate, which is published by the Office for National Statistics and stands at just over 190,000. So, Ruth, I was going to talk to you about one aspect here. These numbers mean that the total number of deaths in the UK within 28 days of a test is just over 169,000. So that means that the 2,400 deaths per million population for the UK, that number is going to get worse. Now, that number of 2,400 deaths per million for the UK compares to 1,500 per million for Germany, 1,300 per million for Ireland, and 469 per million for Norway, around a fifth of the mortality rate from COVID-19 in the UK. These numbers came from the Statista website this afternoon. Now, is this astonishing and depressing disparity? Do you think it's going to reach the consciousness of the people here who have suffered loss and bereavement during the pandemic? Or is this also all still priced into the cost of having a Tory government led by Boris Johnson?
It's very hard, isn't it, not to want to make very clear the culpability of Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party in this horrific figures. I think we should pause always when we talk about these figures, to think 2,000, an extra 2,000 deaths, an extra 2,000 lives, families, friends, so much loss, so much horror in the middle of all that. I think the thing that really distresses me on so many levels is that these are deaths within 28 days of a positive test for COVID. There are thousands and thousands of deaths for people who die after 28 days with COVID, and they appear not to be being counted in these figures because it says 28 days after a test. I would be very interested to see the total figures for people with COVID on the death certificate, because for many people, the being in ICU and the deterioration from COVID and organ failure, often it's 6 weeks after, for example, is what I'm sort of reading from the medical Twitter accounts that I follow. So I fear that there is significantly more blood on the hands of this Westminster government, and their assorted, appalling lack of diligence in protecting the people. You've just today there was a report talking about a spike in hepatitis cases among children, and that hepatitis can't be explained away through the normal viruses one might expect. So
Yep.
the supposition that I am seeing is that this is a consequence of COVID. I have a friend whose son, a young adult male, very, very healthy young lad before COVID, her only child, and he's lost a testicle because COVID caused such severe inflammation through his body that his gonads were inflamed and one of his testes has died. So the COVID hits us in many, many different ways. And it does not surprise me to see that there are children getting this organ inflammation. I think that
Mhm.
the government in Westminster, is is culpable for and has recklessly been so for hundreds of thousands of deaths that we will never see collated because it doesn't suit their narrative. Many, many more, as you said, than comparable nations around the world. And I think that the vaccine rollout has been all that has saved us from worse. I think that the abandoning of masks at this stage and the appearance of a new, even more, I mean, devastatingly more infectious variant that's come out, which is even more contagious, infectious than Omicron, and is yet to be is a variant which apparently incorporates lots of different aspects of various mutated forms of COVID. So goodness knows what's going to be happening with that somewhere down the line. Um, and and the really frustrating thing is that if Scotland had been independent, we could have closed the borders, we could have controlled what was coming into the country by means of air, and we could have done so much more. It's I mean, I'm not fangirling over the First Minister, but I was very, very impressed by the approach that Nicola Sturgeon took to protecting the country. And if Scotland had the normal powers of an independent nation, we would still be suffering. Of course, we would still be suffering from COVID because it's here to stay. But I think that we would have been able to, the mitigations would have seen significantly fewer deaths and significantly fewer long-term effects. I'm still suffering the long-term effects from my COVID vaccines. I mean, I don't know. I've never been confirmed that I've had COVID. I've never had a confirmation of that because I wasn't well before the testing was made available. But I took
Yep.
a really, really severe reaction to the jags. But I still went ahead and got them because out of solidarity with my community. And my goodness, if this is how badly the vaccines affected me, how much worse would a hefty scalp of COVID? I mean, I might not be here sitting talking. So I'm eternally grateful
Yep.
for all those people that got the vaccines out. And I am eternally enraged by the fact that the Tory party in London contributed to unnecessary deaths and misery. And I hope one day there's a day of reckoning.
Completely, Ruth. Thank you. And as you say, whilst we continue to examine and learn more about the virus and the pandemic, the families who have lost loved ones and those who have been lost are never far from our minds. However, time is against us this evening, and so that was our final item. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, culture, and current affairs. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. And please, we really do need all the financial assistance that we can get in order to continue doing what we do. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in then. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching this evening, and of course, I'd like to say a special thanks to our fantastic guest, Ruth Watson. Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure, Ruth. Thank you for joining us. So that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I hope that you can join us again soon on Broadcasting Scotland, but in the meantime, please keep warm and keep well. Bye bye.